L1 or are purely monolingual, using only the target language. That's been a very defining feature of many methods, and battles are fought over that very issue as to whether you should use translation, for example, in the classroom. So this, I think, comes to 9 dimensions, which here are all displayed in terms of polarities. But as I say, they're more clines than polarities in many cases. But I think you can see that if you look at that list there as it is, and if you look at the left-hand side, and if you think for a second what methodology ticks all those boxes on the left-hand side. In other words, where the settings, if you like, the parameter settings are way down this end. Anybody like to suggest a methodology which is form-focused, analytic, the focus on accuracy, on systems, segregated, bilingual? Grammar translation. I mean, particularly the bilingual thing, but grammar translation seems to be, as it's traditionally practiced at least, it was very much down this end of the kind of spectrum. If you go at the other end then, can you think of an approach or a method or a methodology which is functional, experiential, communicative, skills-based, blah, blah, blah? Study abroad. Or immersion. I mean, immersion, in a sense, probably, I mean, non-classroom language learning, in a sense, or learning another subject through English would tick those boxes. I'm thinking also of task-based learning, I think. You know, the strong form, if you like, of the communicative approach ticks all those boxes. But in fact, of course, what we know is that no teacher or no method or no materials is going to be ever that black or white. That probably is more realistic to think of methodology as a sort of wiggly line down the middle. There's sort of a little bit of this and a little bit more of that direction. In fact, it might be an interesting exercise on a teacher training program to ask trainee teachers to say, you just situate yourself on those clines, imagine it's from 0 to 10 or whatever, and put a mark without any values being implied. That just happens to be where you are. And it might be interesting over a period of training to see how people shift, if they do shift. So, now, to finish-ish, how are we going? Spain, are you still with me? One question I'm asked as I travel around regarding methodology is, to what extent is dogma a method? And for this, I need to give a little bit of background. Just in the studio audience, hand up those of you who recognize the term dogma, D-O-G-M-E, in relation to methodology. And I'll see how influential I am in Japan. Not very. Okay. I need to come back. I imagine there's a greater showing of hands in Spain. Just a little bit of background. I mean, Dogma, D-O-G-M-E, was the name of a kind of breakaway filmmaking group in Denmark in the 1995. And they wrote a manifesto where they basically wanted to cleanse filmmaking of the kind of influence of Hollywood, big-budget movies, special effects, fantasy kind of stories, and ground cinema making much more in the real lives of people and using minimal technology, or using only the technology which was necessary to convey those real lives, as it were, and to bring filmmaking back into the hands of people who could afford it. And so they produced a number of films. They produced there was a wave of films from the 1995 to about, until the group disbanded 10 years later, and they each went their own way. One of the filmmakers particularly associated was a Dane called Lars von Trier. You may even have seen some of his movies. Now, Dogma, for me, was a metaphor. I was watching one of these films, and I thought, yeah, actually, you know what? This is what we need in ELT. We need to kind of get back to some of these basics. We seem to be over-resourced. There's too much technology. There's too much of everything in the classroom at the expense of these kind of real learning experiences that we've been reading about. What was interesting for me as a teacher trainer was how many of my teachers aspired to teach consistent with the principles of a communicative approach, and yet actually there was very little real communication happening in their classrooms. And one of the reasons was because there didn't seem to be much space left for it, because they were using so many resources from outside, as it were. And so my approach as a teacher trainer was to say to people, back off, Just use less, but use it more resourcefully. And I guess this relates back to my own experience as a teacher, learning to teach, first of all, in Egypt when I first started, where we had so few resources that you had to become a resourceful teacher in that respect. So I wrote a paper, a short art, again, a sort of tongue-in-cheek article for a journal in 2000 that came out, suggesting that we need to kind of get back to these basics. And that precipitated a online discussion group which has started about the same time with a number of teachers around the world sharing ideas as to how they could realize these kinds of principles, but also bringing into the equation a number of theoretical threads running through mainstream education, progressive education, etc., which kind of supported this view that less means more, or could do. And a manifesto was written, in a sense, to kind of to replicate the sentiment or the rhetoric of the original filmmakers' manifesto, which made claims or suggested that teaching would work best if you just use the materials that are available in the here and now. So teaching should be done using only the resources the teachers and students bring to the classroom, and so on. But boiled down to the basic principles, as we reflected on these 10 years later, what are the basic principles of this kind of philosophy? And one is that dogma is about teaching that is conversation-driven. It's the toil and chat, in a sense, but driven through conversation. Dogma is about teaching that materials light, for all the reasons I've said. And dogma is about teaching that focuses on emergent language, the language that emerges out of these interactions that are set up in the classroom. So that's the background. I'm not here to preach or tell you about dogma. I want to answer the question, which I'm often asked, but haven't you just created a method? And people say accusingly to me, isn't dogma just another method? And I would say, well, let's have a look. Let's see how it figures on these parameters. And then I can tell you, not that it's a method, but I can tell you that it is just another configuration of these same kind of principles. And without going into any detail, I think it's fairly obvious that, again, the configuration is down the other end of the map, as it were. Not dissimilar from task-based learning with a focus on experiential learning, on communication and so on, skills-based. Whether it's actually revolutionary or evolutionary, or even new, is a moot point. And I think actually what I would like to say is that there's nothing new about dogma at all, because if you go back and look at some of those quotations that I was showing you, they're all extremely dogmatic, and yet they're all said over 50 years ago. Find your point of contact in the daily experience of the learners and lead them as speedily as possible to touch the language of daily life. That's a very dogma principle. Either life must be brought into the classroom or the classroom must be taken to life again. The teacher must really be herself and give herself talking to real people about real things and then training her pupils to talk to another about real things. I've corrected the gender bias, you'll notice, in the pronouns to bring it up to date. But the sentiment hasn't changed at all, and it's a very dogma principle. A command of structure is more easily acquired by reading, speaking, and writing the language than by hearing and studying explanations. And the similar view that experiential learning, we teach grammar through conversation, not, as some school teachers attempt, conversation through grammar. And this very, very dogmatic, if you like, the language must not be allowed to stay imprisoned between the pages of the book. Move it beyond the book into the lived lives of the learners. And maybe not even use the book at all. Just start with the lived lives of the learners. And what should the pupils feel about all our English lessons generally? First, they should feel that each lesson is their lesson, not the teacher's. In an English class which is well run, the teacher is only a guide. So in answer to the question then, is dogma new? No. Is dogma a method? No. Nothing is really a method if you buy into the idea that everything is just a configuration of these same principles that go round and around and around. So on that note, we have a few minutes left before we turn off. For questions from the audience in Japan, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes. So if anybody has questions, just put your hand up and we'll bring a microphone to you so our colleagues in Spain can hear you. And while you're formulating your question, can I just alert you to my website where the slides of this presentation will be available, or at least the ones that have text on them, or the most important ones. So if you want to revisit some of those quotations, then feel free. If it's not there immediately, it will be there in a day or two when I get back to Spain. Okay, any questions or comments from the floor in Japan?
We have quite a lively little group on Twitter right now. There's 7 or 8 people twitting back and forth on this presentation right now, as well as on Facebook, a number of people. So just a big shout out and a thank you to everybody who's participating online right now. Any hands up? Another one just came in. Any questions, comments? Yes. Oh, watch. Okay. Yeah.
I just wonder, I'd like to hear a little bit more explanation about the role of the teacher in dogma. It's clearly not transmissive in terms of that factor, but it seems like a stepping away sort of position.
Yeah,
but I wonder what role you see the teacher playing.
In my parameters, I had contrasted one end transmissive with dialogic, and of course dialogic is a term borrowed from critical pedagogy. Paulo Freire in particular used the term dialogic to describe a kind of teaching which he contrasted with the banking kind of teaching, where the teacher places deposits, if you like, in the little empty banks or deposit boxes of the students' heads. Whereas a dialogic pedagogy is one where the teacher dialogues with the students on a more equal footing. And through that dialogue, as Freire says, dialogue was always about something. You can't have contentless dialogue. Once you start dialoguing, talking to somebody, you have content. And he said, take that content and make that the content of your language lesson. So Freire famously in Brazil in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, teaching literacy to Brazilian farm workers, used their experience, their vocabulary to teach them literacy in their first language. So I think that's where I would take it. I say, well, yeah, the dogma teacher probably does much the same, maybe without that critical edge, if you like, and teaching a second language. But once the teacher's aim is to set up these conversations, these dialogues, out of which language affordances will hopefully arise. So I think that's perfectly consistent with a non-transmissive view. Not to say that the teacher isn't also an expert and a guide. The other method, if you like, that I think very close to dogma in that respect is counseling language learning or community language learning, the Charles Curran's humanistic method of the 60s and 70s, where the students sat in a closed circle. And that's why I use this image here of a closed circle, where the teacher nowhere to be seen, in a sense, where the students teach themselves. But the teacher is there, in a sense. The teacher is outside the circle as a consultant and a guide. But the class belongs to the students. Yes?
Here's our good friend Fergus.
Hello. Just some people say about Task Bacon say about dog meat.